Okay, let's look at asking questions. So as we go through all of these expenses, it would be good to understand where these go and how they're categorized. So if I look at plant manager, as you look at this, we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of expenses. And then each one of those expenses can either be direct or indirect, or they're going to be factory overhead, or they're going to break down into sales and administrative. So let's kind of go through these and get comfortable with what they are. Um, Salary is going to be obviously labor. Anything that's a salary or a wage is going to be labor. But what kind of labor? Is it direct or is it indirect? Does the plant manager actually make that product? No. Then he becomes an indirect labor. And you're going to put it in the indirect labor column. Anything that's indirect materials or labor or expense goes into the factory overhead column. These three funnel right in there. Factory maintenance supplies. Now, in most cases, that could either come out as a factory overhead expense, such as something as an indirect expense, or it could be an indirect material. And in this case, we're going to look at it as a material. So yes, it's a material if I knew enough about it. And is it a direct material or an indirect material? If it's a direct material, it goes into a significant cost of it. Now, this really could be either way. It could be a material or expense. It just depends on how they define the maintenance supplies. Either way, it's going to end up in factory overhead. Salary of the process engineers. Okay, process engineers means it's on the floor, it's in the production realm. So what is that? Number one, it's labor. Number two, is it direct or indirect? Down here. If it is direct, are they physically making this part? No, but they are supporting making that part. They're designing. So they become an indirect labor, and that also goes into factory overhead. So now we have wages paid to the packaging department employees. That's pretty concrete. That's labor, right? Is it indirect or direct? Well, they are physically putting this product in a package so that it can be sold. So they're working on the product. So that becomes a direct labor. Doesn't go into factory overhead. It's going to be part of that direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead, which is your cost of goods manufactured. So now we have scents and fragrances used in making soaps and detergents. There again, you are looking at a material. Is it direct or indirect? This could go either way. I think in this case, they have said it is a direct material. It is significant in the cost of the material, so it's going to be called a direct material product or expense. Then we have wages of production line employees. So how would you define that? Okay, it's labor, all right? Is it direct or is it indirect? Well, they're directly working on the product, so it becomes a direct labor. And now we start getting a little bit away from things that are concrete. We're going to look at depreciation on the assembly line. So what kind of expense is that? Well, it's something to do with production. It is directly related to the facilities, so that's going to be a factory expense because we're dealing with the facilities. And what kind is it? Is it an expense used to support production? Is it an expense to support the factory facilities? Well, it's going to fall in this factory facilities. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with the product, but yet it does with the support. So that's going to make it fall into the indirect expense. And I'm going to freeze this for you so it stays, so you can see where it's going as soon as I find my freeze frames. That should do it. So now we are down to depreciation. And our next one is packaging materials. Well, what is that? Packaging materials is a material, obviously. Is it direct or indirect? And if it is material or significant, it's going to be considered a direct material. So, because it is part of the product in a way. Think your iPhone, think your Samsung phone. The packaging really is part of the product. So now we have resins for body wash. Again, this could go either way, depending on how significant it is. So what is it? It's a material. Is it direct or indirect? I believe this time they said it was an indirect because it's insignificant and it's hard to measure how much they're going to use. So it's just part of a very small part of the product. They're going to call it an indirect at this point. How about depreciation on the plant? Okay, this is the factory they're talking about. So what kind of expense is that? Well, probably it's a factory expense. And as you look at it, it's used for support of the factory facilities. So that's going to run into depreciation. So you're going to end up putting that as an indirect expense. I can't tie it to a material, I can't tie it to a labor, but I can tie it to the factory itself. It's supporting that product. Let's keep going. Now here's one we just threw in here to confuse you, right? Dividends paid to shareholders. What does that do? Anything. Does it touch direct materials? No. Direct labor? No. Indirect labor? No. It has nothing to do with any materials. Again, it doesn't support the factory in any way whatsoever. And if you really come down, it's not a product cost, which is going to be one of these, and it's not a period cost because a period cost is sales or administrative. Actually, it's not a cost at all. If you look at it, yes, it comes out of retained earnings, but it's not classified as a cost. So it becomes other. So you have to kind of understand the income statement and how the accounts work to do this. So let's go down to machine lubricant used to maintain the assembly line. That's a lot, right? So how did they classify that? They looked at that as an indirect material. It is an actual something they bought, like a supply, but it's called indirect materials. It doesn't actually support, or it doesn't actually touch the product, but it is needed to produce that product. So that becomes an indirect. How about leather used on vehicles? Well, what is that? That's a material, correct? Is it direct or indirect? Well, it's pretty direct because it makes up part of the product and it is significant. So that is going to be a direct material. Now, next one, depreciation on mechanical robots used on the assembly line. Well, depreciation should be a big key here. Depreciation on the plant was an indirect expense. Depreciation on the robots is going to be a factory expense, and it's going to, I gotta keep moving this up, be an expense for the factory facilities, which is going to make it an indirect expense. So that goes into factory overhead then. So now consultant fees for study of production of line efficiency. Okay, fees, number one. This could go either way. I would probably put this in labor. I guess I'm wrong. You could put it in labor, or you could put it in indirect expense. I think it kind of depends on how you want to look at that fee as it stands. If it's a consultant fee from within, I would probably go with indirect labor. If it's a consultant fee from without, from external to the facility, you've hired somebody to come in, you might say that's an indirect. You can see a lot of these in the factory overhead category. A lot depends on how the accountant and the management want to define this. So dealership sales incentives, aha. This would also be what I would call a commission or an incentive. So what do I do with that? If you move this down a little bit, it's not a material, it's not a labor, it's not a factory expense, but there's that word sales, and it's an sales expense. So it does not end up anywhere in the cost of goods manufactured. It's going to come over here and be a period cost. Next one, Vice President of Human Resources salaries. Again, has nothing to do with production here. Even though without them, we wouldn't have any workers, it's still once removed, twice removed actually. So that one also is, you would classify that as sales is a sales department, correct? Can I go any lower? Yeah. Here's our sales and administrative. So there's your sales. Administrative costs are going to be the VP, and that's going to be a period cost. Now, office utilities, how does that affect? Is that in the factory whatsoever? No. That is an administrative function that is a clerical function that supports the product. So that's going to become a period cost, office utilities. I would bet you know what to do with advertising now. It's an advertising expense. Advertising is a sales. It has nothing to do with production on the production floor. So that's going to go under a period cost. And finally, one that could be a little bit confusing is the property taxes on the headquarters building. Number one, if that were property taxes on the factory, right, that would be an indirect expense. But this is property taxes on headquarters. Does headquarters have anything to do with making that product? No, there's no production whatsoever in the headquarters. That's an administrative cost and would be a period cost. So I'm hoping this helps a little bit. Now, a lot of these, there are really no definite answers to. A lot of it's going to depend on production. It's going to depend on your managers and when everybody sits down to define how to categorize this information. So there's leeway in this. So kind of go through this, and hopefully these questions will help a little bit. And I will post these questions in Module 1 so that you can print it out and have it just for some general referencing if you need to be. Thank you.